So in today's video, I'm going to show you a very simple way of painting hydrangeas. Normally, this is kind of a difficult flower to paint, but I'm going to show you a mind-blowing trick that'll make it super easy. As usual, you can follow this tutorial with any brushes you want, but I'll list the ones I'm using in the description. So the first thing I'm going to do is paint 3 simple flowers. So for the brush, I'm going to grab the smooth round, and I'm just going to use a very light version of my flower color, and I'm going to create some stroke-based flowers. So for example, I'm just starting out with a little bit of pressure, pressing harder, and then kind of tapering it off. And each flower is going to have 4 petals. After that, I'm going to continue with the same color and the same brush, and layer on a couple of strokes like this, just so it looks like there's a little bit more detail in each petal. After that, I'm going to change my color to a very light version of my flower color, and I'm going to do a little dot in the middle of each one. And once I'm happy with the colors of these flowers, I'm going to finish them up by adding some outlines and some details. So for that, I'll make a layer above my flowers. I'm going to choose a slightly darker version of my flower tone. For the brush, I like to use something scratchy, so I'm going to go to the drawing tab and use the little pine brush. And I'm just going to use it to create a somewhat broken outline around each petal. Then after that, I'm going to add a little bit of a squiggle to the middle of each one as well. Now these flowers look really good, but they have a sort of invisible problem, so I'm going to demonstrate that so you can see it. If I make a layer that's underneath all the flowers, and I choose any random color, and I just scribble under it here, you can see even though the flowers are above the scribbly line, you can see through the flowers. So what I need to do next is eliminate that transparency. So to do that, it's really simple. See, our flower here, they're made of 2 layers. Here's the main colors, and then here's the outline. I'm going to duplicate the main colors layer. Then I'm going to select the bottom one, the original one, and I'm going to raise the brightness of it all the way to max, so it becomes basically pure white. And you can see this in the layers panel. Here's the colored one, and then here's the pure white one. And already you can see that's reduced the transparency, but if I duplicate the white version a few times, usually around 3 times is enough, the transparency is almost eliminated. And I'm happy with how this looks, so I'm going to merge all the flower layers together onto one. And once these 3 kind of main flowers are finished, we can move on and start building the whole structure of the hydrangea. So I'm going to move my 3 flowers off to the side for now. I'm going to make a blank layer and move it below the flowers. And I'm just going to create a kind of dark background to arrange these all on. So for the brush, I'm going to go back to the watercolor kit and use the smooth round. And I'm going to use a couple of darker versions of our flower tone and just create this kind of ball shape. And I'm going to go around it concentrically with darker and darker colors, so it has darker areas like this in the center. After that, I want to soften everything at once, and the easiest way to do that is with the Gaussian blur. And I can just kind of drag on my screen and adjust that. And once the background's finished, we can finally move on and start building our flower. So for that, I'm going to grab our original 3 flowers. I'll position them here onto the background, and I'm going to create a bunch of duplicates of it just by duplicating that layer. And I'm going to position them and fit them together sort of like puzzle pieces. You can use the mirror tools and also the warp tools to get it to fit. It's okay if they overlap a little bit, but try not to overlap them too much. And this arrangement looks pretty good. I've got a lot of interesting space between the flowers, which is ideal, but this process has left me with a couple of gaps where I'd like to position individual flowers. So if you want to do that, it's super easy. I'm just going to create a duplicate of the flowers again, but this time I'm going to move it off to the side. Then I can grab the selection tool, set to freehand, and I can select an individual flower like this, and then use the arrow tool to move it into position. And I'm going to do this to fill all the remaining big gaps. And there we go, that's pretty well filled out. And I did this on quite a few different flower layers, so I'm going to merge them all together onto one. And I want to increase the density of this, so instead of repositioning more flowers, I can just duplicate our original arrangement, select the lower one, and then we can move it around kind of beneath those initial flowers. So I think what I'll do is I'll just rotate it a little bit and then position it like that. Now, in order to add a sense of depth, it makes sense that the flowers in the front are brighter than the ones behind them. So here are the ones that are behind. I'm just going to darken those a little bit. And there we go. I think this arrangement looks really good. The edges here definitely need some work, and I think the best way to do that is to kind of shape it by erasing it. But everything so far has been painted on these 3 layers, so I recommend merging them together onto one, then grabbing the eraser brush, which is set to the fine liner pen, and I'm just going to use that kind of along the edge, just erasing any of the flower petals that stick out too far, and making the shape here a bit cleaner. Now the next step is very optional, but sometimes when you create flowers by duplicating kind of individual elements a lot of times, the end result just looks a little bit too complex and intense. So one thing I like to do is apply a kind of softening effect. So to do that, I'm going to grab the selection tool, set to freehand, and I'm going to create a bunch of small, random, disconnected selections like this. Then I'm going to feather them all out at the same time. Then I'll go to my adjustments here, Gaussian blur, and I'm just going to blur the areas that I selected, and you can see it applies a very nice kind of softening effect. There we go. And I think I want to add it a little bit more down here, so I'll do it again. And I'm not exactly sure why, but softening the illustration this way just makes it feel much more lighter and peaceful. The next step is also optional, but I recommend kind of adjusting the overall contrast of this. Sometimes when you paint things, you don't get the colors exactly right, but in Procreate we can adjust them after the fact. So what I recommend doing in this case is going to the adjustments, going to the curves, making sure it's set up here to gamma, and you can play around with the curve here, just making very simple adjustments. And I think you'll find if you raise the top a little bit, along with the bottom, you can give it a more kind of light and kind of airy contrast effect. And once the flower portion here is pretty much finished, we can move on and start adding some leaves. And we're going to do this using a similar process we used to make the flowers. I'm just going to make one leaf and then kind of duplicate it around. So I'm going to make another blank layer, but make sure it's below the flowers. I'll grab my green leaf color. For the brush, I'm going to use the abstract round, and I'm just going to create a kind of random shape like this, just overlapping a lot of strokes. Then I'm going to grab my water blender brush and just soften everything. After that, I can go back to my eraser, which is still set to the fine liner pen, and I'm going to use this to cut this out into a leaf shape. Then all I gotta do is just create a couple copies of this leaf layer. I think 3 is enough, and I'm gonna move them into position using the arrow tool. And this is gonna vary from flower to flower, but this one turned out to be pretty transparent. So you can see on this side, the leaf is kind of showing through. So if that's happening to you, I recommend merging all the leaves together onto one layer. Then you can grab the eraser brush and just erase any area that's showing through. So I'm just erasing kind of behind the flower and just the edge of the leaf. And that's pretty much it for the hydrangea. Next, I'm going to show you an easy way to paint a glass to display it in. So for that, I'm going to make a blank layer, and I'm going to move it below everything. I'm going to use a very, very light bluish gray tone. For the brush, I'm going to use the abstract round, and I'm just going to rough out a kind of cylinder shape. After that, I'm going to go over it again with an even lighter gray, and just focus this on the middle portion. Then I'm going to change my brush back to the smooth round, and I'm going to use a darker bluish gray, a few different shades of this, and I'm just going to go along the edge of the glass a couple of times. And that looks pretty good. The kind of middle portion of the glass, it needs to be almost pure white. It's a little bit too dark in this case, so I'm going to use another very, very light bluish gray tone and try to lighten the center here. There we go, that looks pretty good. Next, I'm going to grab my water blender brush, and I'm going to use it at a pretty big size, and just in a couple areas, I'm going to kind of draw the edge of the glass here into the center. And since glass is a really smooth material, it makes sense that the edge of it is very clean and sharp. So I'm going to grab the eraser brush and use it at a really small size to kind of smooth out and perfect the edge. Next, I want to add some water to this glass. So since water is basically invisible, I'm just going to paint some reflections. So for that, I'm going to change my brush back to the smooth round. I'm going to create another layer above my glass. And I'm going to use another very light blue tone, but something that's just a little bit darker than the interior area of this glass. And I'm going to use it to paint on these kind of foreshortened oval shapes. I'll do one in the middle like this. That's basically the water level. And then I'll do one more here at the bottom. After that, I'm going to change this layer here with the reflections. I'm going to change the transparency mode to multiply. And then I can adjust it and set it to a point where it's barely visible. There we go. If you want to, you can also grab the water blender and use it to smooth kind of the outer edges of the oval. And once the glass is full of water, we can add the stem from the hydrangea. So I'll make another blank layer. I'm going to choose a very desaturated kind of brownish straw tone. For the brush, I want to use something scratchy, so I'm going to use the little pine brush again. And I'm just going to use that to draw the stem. And you can see I'm just drawing it so it enters kind of the edge of the water and then suddenly kind of appears back just a little bit off to the right. And this gives it a sense of kind of diffraction. Now usually when objects enter the water like this, the portion that's underwater might look a little bit brighter and a little bit lighter colored. So to get that effect, I'm going to use the selection tool set to freehand. I'm just going to select the bottom portion of the stem. Then I can go to hue, saturation, and brightness. I can saturate it quite a bit and also raise the brightness. Now this glass looks pretty good, but sometimes when you paint it, it might end up looking a little bit dirty or smudged. And I think the best way to solve that is again using the curves tool. So if you want to do that, just make sure all the layers for the glass are merged together onto one. And these are separate from the stem and the flower. And just select the layer with the glass. Go to the curves tool, make two little nodes, and just play with those and kind of adjust the overall contrast, and this will usually sharpen it up. And just like that, these hydrangeas are finished. Before I go, I want to kind of reinforce something I kind of barely touched on earlier. So when we use this technique of just painting a couple of flowers and then duplicating them like 100 times to create a cluster like this is a useful trick that can definitely speed up the painting process. Sometimes with watercolor illustration, it doesn't really look quite right when you have hundreds of perfectly sharp flowers. So I highly recommend using that Gaussian blur trick I mentioned earlier to soften some of the details, especially the ones that are kind of outside of the focal point. If you like this video and this teaching style, here are 2 more watercolor flower tutorials that I think you'll love to watch next.